Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we are going to talk about red hair, painting red hair. We're going to do this as part of a series on over the next month or so, month or two, about painting different colors of hair. I happen to be working on a L'Oreal, as you can see here, and for purposes of greater things that are going on with this model, her hair is going to be this red color. On the camera it looks quite bright red. It is not as red in real life. And that's the first thing we're going to talk about. So you'll notice this model basically has some zenithal. I've worked in some flesh shading and such already because there were things I wanted to do with the airbrush first before I got into this. And now we're going to talk about the hair. Now, L'Oreal has rather long and crazy hair, but the basic lessons are going to be the same. And the first lesson is this with red hair. It shouldn't be cartoon red. That is to say, if you have a bright color red, let's say like our classic Vallejo model color 926 red. This is a pretty flat red. This is too bright. You can see how bright that is compared to her hair. This is too bright. Unless you're painting an anime model or a chibi or something like that. If you're trying to emulate any kind of real red hair, that's too bright. The other important lesson about hair is that one of the reasons it's so complicated is that there's not really that many great ways to cheat with hair. Because hair is, the color of hair is actually composed of, thousands upon thousands of tiny follicles that are all slightly different colors. Okay? And your eye tends to blank all that out and perceive it as one color, but it's obviously not. And so, hence what we're going to get into today. So, what have I done here? Well, we did a little zenithal. You can see it looks darker from the bottom than from the top. But now I have these paints laid out. What do I have here? I've got some Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a nice dark brown. I've got some Model Air Random Tan, which is a very nice warm yellow-white. I've got some actual Game Ink Yellow. I've got some Bloodletter Glaze. I've got some Minotaur Angelic Blood. And I've got some Scale Color 75 African Shadow. Okay, and this is what I'm going to use to do my red hair. Now, if you don't have this weird collection of paints that I have, because I'm a paintaholic, that's okay. Most of the key with doing red is the following. You need a solid, somewhat muted red, okay, which we're going to desaturate some more, and you'll see how we do that a little later on with other colors I don't even have here, but you can do it with anything. If you go back to my video on desaturating red, and we're going to use white to cause some stronger color shifts when we then lay yellow and this very orangey red back over it. Okay, so that's the basic premise. Let's start at the beginning. Let's take some of our Army Painter Strong Tone. The first thing I'm going to do is not just wash her hair down completely. Now, I am going to lay some wash into it, but I'm going to be a little more careful about it. And the reason for that is because I don't want to just get that color everywhere. This strong tone, what I want to do is I want to force it up here, up under her hood, right? And then into some areas here where I think her hair would be naturally darker. I'm not going to let it pool. I'll pull it out of there. I'm not washing all the hair. Okay. And the idea here is we're just trying to lay in some shadows, some deeper shadows. Most of what we're going to do is going to be to go up. Now, you can go up in a lot of different ways in red, as I've talked about before. Red hair is interesting because you can work in a lot of different colors. If it's strawberry blonde, it can have more flesh tones in it. If it's, you can have oranges in there, you can have yellows in there even. Red hair is composed of lots of different fascinating colors. Okay, so we're just kind of pushing some of this around up into these shadowed areas where I want the hair to be darker. It's not moving the needle a huge amount. I'm going to kind of run it along the bottom because I want the shadow to fall there. Okay? All right. So you can see there how we kind of worked some of those darker colors in. Okay. Now, let's start doing the interesting work. Okay. So what I want to do is start working in some brighter colors. Okay. That shadow there that I did, that's just the first step. The key to doing red hair or any hair convincing is just a lot of short, constant, repetitive, simple, quick strokes. Okay? So let's take some random tan, which, as I said, if you don't have this particular color, any warm white will do. You could use any bone or anything like that. Okay? So I've already got some over on my palette here. Okay. And it's fairly thin. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab some individual follicles here. And I'm just going to trace them along. And I'm going to get some of this excess paint off my brush because I'm just cruising for a bruising here. Okay. And I'm just going to go along and grab some of these edges. Especially where I want there to be a light point. So one great resource, if you want to know how to paint hair really effectively, just Google like hair color boxes. You know, like the things that your wife or significant other or maybe you yourself use to change your hair color. That's like those boxes. I don't know any brand names of it, but you know what I mean. Like hair color in a box. Because one of the things that tends to happen there that's really nice is they create those light points really well. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create one light spot coming here and then more down here where her hair is getting the most thin, and we'd have the individual follicles. Okay? All right. You'll notice that I'm edging this when I'm doing it. So I'm relying mainly on the side of my brush, and I'm being very, very light touch about it. We're not laying it in real hard, right? So we go nice and light, very light touch, very light touch. Just we quickly, oops, missed there a little. It's okay. That's why we use nice wet paint. And we're just going to kind of push that around. We very quickly, there you go. So now you can see we've created these white lines. Okay, now as it stands right now, that looks pretty goofy. And that's okay. Because what we're doing here, I'm just going to grab a couple from these follicles up here. What we're doing here is creating the individual, the illusion of individual follicles. And the key here is with this, we can't really dry brush this, right? Like, her hair is not in such a place to be dry brushed. That's a good way to get a lot of these quickly in some models. I'm never that much of a fan of it. You can do it a little bit. Okay, but there we go. So now you can see we've got these bright white spots. Okay, all right. So you can see how we've got some shadow down in here. And you can see how we've got these bright white lights. So now let's make some highlights. To do that, we're going to go to our yellow ink. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly start bringing these back in together. Okay? Now, I already have some yellow ink over here on my palette. So what I'm going to do is just actually run that right over all the spots where I put this white. Now, I'm not just hitting the white, I'm being a little heavier, right? Because I want this to run over onto the red. And I want to start bringing these back together. The advantage of working with red hair, the really nice part about it, is that red itself is a very translucent color. So red naturally blends very easy. The reason I did this big jump up as opposed to trying to go to like the next color red and then the next color red is because it lets me see where my highlights are and build in shadows, which is more easily than building up highlights with red. Okay, so now you can see we've turned all of these white spots yellow. Okay. Just making sure we got all of them. There we go. Okay, so now we still got something that looks quite clown car-ish, and that's all right. That's what we're going to look like for a little while here. You're going to have to trust me as we go along on this journey. Next up, we're going to grab our bloodletter. Now, I love bloodletter. This is one of my favorite glazes from GW. All of these glazes are actually quite great. They're some of my favorite GW paints. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it along the whole thing. But again, I'm not being too careful about it. I'm not getting it in where it's pooling. I don't want it to pool. Don't let it pool down in the space. Okay, you want to leave your darker tones down there. You don't want to start overwriting them just yet. Instead, I'm just being a little bit less clean with my brush and letting it hit a fatter area. Okay. And you can see what's happening now is we're just bringing that yellow, which we turned that white straight to yellow. Now we're just bringing it back into the range of the rest of our colors. We're turning it orange. What we need is a lot of different colors to simulate hair, because we need all these different colors interacting in a favorable way. Each little layer of color creates another little place for the light to bounce off of, creates another little point to trick the eye. Okay? And that's what we want to do. Because there's no way we can actually paint at this scale 10,000 little tiny follicles, right? I mean, that's just not possible. So instead, we have to try to trick the eye into believing there's that many different things going on. Okay? Okay. So now we're going to let that dry completely for a moment. But you can see how we're starting to bring it back into line. Let's close the bloodletter just because I can see the nightmare world where I knock that and tip it over. Now we're going to go back to our regal blood. This was our initial sort of base color. Or, sorry, angelic blood. My fault. Again, this is just a fairly desaturated red. You can use whatever you want. Whatever you've got that's kind of off color. I don't know the GW equivalent to this. This is one of my favorite Badger Minutair colors. If you were in Vallejo model color, probably Gory Red is fairly close to this. Something like that. So, you're just, your mileage may vary. It doesn't really matter. Find something that's not bright clown pastel red and you're in the right place, okay? There you go. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and water down some of this red here over on my palette. And you can see that's about where I'm at. Okay, this is pretty watery. Okay, so now I'm going to start tracing up some of these lines. But I'm not hitting the whole thing this time. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm kind of smoothing out toward the edges, right? So where my white lines have some end, and it's fairly stark. But what I'm going to do here is grab the edge of that line and just kind of fuzz it out. Right? So what I get is this nice, bright, hot point left when I take it each direction. Again, red being a very transparent paint, still certainly shows through the color underneath. Okay? But now it's just bringing it all into that same tone. And what we get is this nice, rich, naturally blended highlight because we've used this thinner layer to bring it all together. Okay? So now what we've got is something like that. Okay? Now, if you don't want this to be, if you don't want any hints of, in this case, because I'm painting her in this sort of very autumnal new life scheme, I want the oranges in there. If you don't want the oranges and the yellows, one thing you could do, okay, is you could take your sort of white color And we could trace our white color along here, right? I'll put this back on. We'll knock the white back in for a second here for the example. Okay. Right? And then instead of going to through the middle steps, I'm just going to go straight to the watered down red. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run that straight over the top. And what we get there, since it's the white going over since it's the red going straight over the white, is something that looks a little more pink. Okay? All right. So where do we go from here? Because we've got some nice colors laid in here. Even though on camera it looks really orange, I assure you in real life it is not quite that orange. Well, where we go from here is now we start repeating this same thing over and over again. What I'm going to do, you may ask, what's the plum for? Because he didn't use that yet. Well, the plum is to work in more of my shadows. This is actually like a flesh shadow color, but that plum is an extremely desaturated purple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that down in some of the shadows, because I've got my basic highlights in there. But now the key with doing the hair and making it look right is we simply do it over and over and over again. Okay? So I've got a little bit of this plum. And what I'm going to do is just work some of it down into these shadows. And it's just this very, very desaturated color. So it just takes the life right out of those shadows, which is what we want. We want them to fall away. We want the bright to be really bright. Okay? So now you can see, look right in there. See how much flatter that looks? And how much brighter that yellow looks against it? That's what we're going to do. I'm gonna pause here. I'm going to repeat the same steps you just saw, but in slightly different locations. I'll draw slightly new lines. I'll wash everything, or I'll shade everything down again. And I'm just slowly building up. Each time I'm tracing different strands, leaving slightly different highlights. I'm still trying to build my main highlights being right in here and right in here on the edges. Okay? And what we get by doing multiple different layers of these glazes and highlights is something that looks very organic and natural. Okay. So I'll be back in a moment, and we'll see how we look. All right, and we're back. So, you can see, let's actually zoom in here just a little. There we go. All right, so you can see that we've done a lot of different layers on this back and forth. I actually went over the whole thing 2 more times in exactly the same way you saw me do it once already, right? And you can see that now what we've got is some really nice shadows laid up in here. We've got some really nice highlights. Let's flip it around here to the other side. Okay? And you can see we've created these very bright spots. Now again, what I'll say is her hair has a lot of oranges and yellows because I want her to have this very natural, sort of fall leaf hair. If I was doing a really natural red hair, I would not work in this amount of orange. I would use a lot more of just sort of the white and the red and layer it back and forth with my deeper shadows like the plum. Okay? Because normal red hair probably doesn't often have this insane level of orangeness or yellow to it. Now, again, in real life, this isn't quite so stark. White balance on camera is being what it is. All right, so now let's talk about some craziness we can do if we want to go up to the next level. What you can go from here is to start slowly mixing these together. These are all on your palette. So we can take some of our yellow, we can bring it into some of our red, so we get a rich orange, and we can start just kind of very carefully smoothing those edges some more. Just glazing in some of that color. All these little touches like this, none of them are going to be essential. None of them are what you absolutely need to do. But it's a bunch of little things like that. Sorry. It's a bunch of little things like that where we can just kind of lay it in there, that middle color. We can just kind of push these around back and forth. We can take some of the yellow, mix it with a little of the white, okay? And we can just sort of work our tips or our highlights or where we want the shine point to be back up there. I keep doing that off camera, goodness sakes. Okay, or we can just sort of work the shine point back up there, right? So at this point what we're doing is just these slight little touches. I can keep bringing in just a little more white, just a little more white, right? So that I get just slightly brighter in a very small area on that middle piece, right? Because the key to the shine of hair is that it needs to look like it's actually moving, like you're tracing some line. Again, if you go look at your hair dye boxes, what you're going to see is that, like, around the crown, which obviously she doesn't have because she's wearing this big headpiece, but around the crown they create this little light spot, right, where the overhead light is hitting. Now they actually do a lot of that with Photoshop. Most of that isn't done with, some of that is done with lighting that's there in the studio and then it's built up. We're going to do it all with paint, obviously, and we're going to reinforce the lighting. So what I'm doing here is just sort of working through my entire spectrum in very, very thin glazes to just bring that right back up. Okay? And so what I get, if I do that a couple times, is this nice little point where I can trace the light across. Okay. So now let's talk about one final interesting trick. And we're going to go a strange direction here. One of the things you have to watch out for when you start working in things like, and one of the reasons I don't like using a thing like Agrax and just slapping it over red. Though certainly if you're trying to be quick, if I was like speed painting an army and not working on a character like this, that's obviously going to be the center point of an army. If you got 50 models with red hair, okay, lay down a mid-tone red like that, probably hit them with Agrax, and that's a good way to cut out shadows. This is more, you can sort of pick your poison here, or hit them with strong tone or whatever. But when you're working on something like this, and you want it to look, you know, as good as possible, here's an interesting thing we can do with our red. We're going to get out our Vallejo Game Air dark green. So this is kind of the equivalent of, like the Dark Angel green, I think is about the equivalent in the GW range, something like that. It's a very deep hunter green. Okay? Now what I'm going to do, and you're going to think I'm absolutely crazy here. I'm going to get some of that green on just the tip of my brush. I'm using a very fine tipped brush here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay some of that thinned green right down in there, in the deep, deep recesses. I'm going to draw a few lines coming down with that green where I want a nice dark shadow. Okay, just taking a little of that green, and I'm very, very carefully laying it in there. Now she's got this big, beautiful, ridiculous hair. If you were doing witch elves or something and you had them with red, you could be doing the same trick. If you had somebody smaller, like a Bretonnian damsel, you could work this into some shadow points on them. There's all sorts of models where this could work. Again, consider this an extra step. If I was going to absolutely speed paint red, like I had a bunch of models with red hair and I need to do it as fast as possible, I would mid-tone it in red. I'd use that desaturated red. I'd hit them with like an Agrax or a strong tone. And then I'd dry brush them with, with that sort of white, very, very lightly and carefully. And then I would thin down my red to a glaze, and I'd put a couple of those on. Okay, so now I've laid this green in here in the deepest parts. And look what's happened. Goodness sakes. Look what's happened. Look at the shadows that green creates. Now what I'm going to do is, without really cleaning my brush, I'm going to go into that red, same red I've been using. I'm going to mix some very thinned red. leaving the green on there. So what I get is something that looks like that. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to trace all my same lines I just did. Okay? Now, what we get here is by layering it over like this, what we get is this completely desaturated red. Okay? And so what this gives us is basically a perfect shadow. If you've ever watched oil colorists paint flesh, they actually start by laying green down on the face over where the red is going to be, like where the red of the cheeks is going to be. And the reason for that is because it's going to naturally desaturate when they put the brighter red colors over top and create the effect they're actually going for. Okay? So what I'm doing is just taking that thinned red and just running a layer of it over all the green lines I just made. And so now what we get is some really, really nice shadows that have a rich tone to them because it's green filtered through red, producing a perfectly desaturated red. Okay? So instead of trying to darken the color directly, we're relying on the transparent nature of the color to create our very strong shadows. So now if you look in here, look at how strong those shadows look. And the reason for that is because I've got that dark green on the bottom, right? And then I've got this red over top. So very quickly I'll build in another one here. Let's say I wanted a shadow running right down here, right down this ridge to kind of break up this long flat spot. I'm just going to run a line of green right down there like that. So this is more or less pure green. I'm going to run it right down that line. Okay? Okay. So you can see it there. Alright. So I let that dry. It only takes a second because we're working in very thinned paints. Now I'm going to take my red, thinned down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to coat right over top of that green. I'm going to use the transparent nature of it, and now we have a wonderful, wonderful, nice dark shadow right there on the top of that line, which is going to make that yellow that's right there pop out even more. Okay? Look at how bright that heat spot looks on the shimmer, on the ridge of her hair now, because we've laid those deep shadows in between. Right? Brighter things look brighter when they're up against darker things. So, there you go. That's red hair. I know that was a lot. As always, you can cut out steps of this. As I said, if I was going to do this in the fastest way possible, mid-tone red, hit it with a strong toner and Agrax, lightly dry brush some of your white color, and then glaze on or layer on some of your red, or maybe a layer of yellow like ink or something, or wash. There's lots of good yellow washes from Citadel you could use, and then bring your red in if you're trying to do, say, like army painting, as opposed to, say, one very special character that you want to look really nice. But for the most part, there you go. That's a long, detailed tutorial on lots of ways you can attack red hair. Like I said, we're gonna touch more of these colors in the future. I hope you found this one interesting on doing very detailed red hair, and I hope you're able to apply it to some of your own models. As always, give it a like if you liked it. Comment down below for what topics you'd like to see covered in future hobby cheating videos. Subscribe to see future videos, and as always, we'll see you next time.